Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. So, today we're diving into how we think, and we're going to be using Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman as our guide. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, we use our minds all the time, obviously, but we rarely actually stop and think about thinking. You know what I mean? So, get ready to uncover some surprisingly fun facts about how your mind works.
Yeah, it's true. Our minds are often a total mystery, even to ourselves, right? But understanding how our thought processes work can be so valuable. I mean, it can help us make better decisions and avoid some of those classic thinking traps we all fall into.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Kahneman's big idea is that our brains work using two different systems, right? So,
Mm,
system one, that's the fast one. It's all about intuition, emotion, automatic. It's how you recognize like a friend's face instantly or
mm.
how you just know, like 2 plus 2, 4 without even having to think about it.
Yeah, system one is all about efficiency, right? It kind of lets us navigate the world without like overthinking every single little thing. Just
Yeah.
imagine if we had to consciously think through every step of like walking or driving,
Oh my God.
we'd be exhausted.
That's so true. This reminds me, I was driving once and I totally swerved to avoid something in the road. And then I realized like a second later, it was just a shadow. Talk about a classic system one reaction.
Oh, totally.
But I guess that speed, that instant reaction, it has a trade-off, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
Hmm.
system one is very prone to what we call biases. These are those like systematic errors in judgment, right? And Kahneman refers to the mental shortcuts we use as heuristics. Now, while these heuristics can be super helpful a lot of the time, they can also, sometimes lead us astray.
So a heuristic, is that kind of like a rule of thumb? Like it's helpful in most cases, but not always perfect?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. One example of this is what we call the law of small numbers. And basically, this is our tendency to draw huge conclusions, like really big, sweeping conclusions from very, very limited data. Like we see a pattern, maybe in a small sample, and we just assume that it applies much more broadly, even when statistically that's super unlikely.
Hmm. It reminds me of that story in the book about Kahneman advising the Israeli Air Force. It was during the Yom Kippur War, and they were trying to figure out why one particular squadron had way more losses than others, even though their skill and strategy seemed pretty equal.
Oh, right. And Kahneman, being the expert in the law of small numbers, he argued that it was very likely just random chance. There was no complex cause. And get this, he actually advised them to just stop investigating altogether. He thought it was futile and could even be harmful to morale.
Wow. So I guess the takeaway there is sometimes the simplest explanation, even if it's just luck, is actually the best one. But that kind of goes against our natural tendency as humans, doesn't it? Like we want to find those patterns and explanations.
Totally, absolutely. Now, in contrast to system one, we have system two, and this one's much slower, more deliberate, logical. This is the system you'd use to solve a complicated math problem or learn a new language or, carefully analyze a tricky situation.
So if system one is kind of like being on autopilot,
Ah,
system two is more like taking manual control.
precisely.
Okay.
And both are absolutely essential. So system one, that keeps us functioning efficiently in our day-to-day lives, and then system two allows us to really make those considered decisions when we need to.
But wouldn't it just be better if we could use system two all the time? I mean, if it's more logical, shouldn't it always lead to better choices?
Well, not necessarily, right? Because
Mhm.
system two actually requires a ton of effort, a lot of mental energy.
Mm.
If we try to use it for every single decision we make, what to wear or what to eat,
Yeah.
we'd be totally wiped out.
That's true. I mean, yeah. Choosing what to have for breakfast shouldn't require a full-on spreadsheet and a cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
the key is really finding that balance, right? Like
Mm.
knowing when to trust your gut and when you really need to slow down and think things through.
So understanding these systems and all their little quirks and biases, that's super crucial. It's not about getting rid of system one altogether, but more about knowing when it might be leading us down the wrong path. So this brings us to all those specific thinking errors that Kahneman talks about, right? The ones we're all prone to, no matter how rational we think we are.
Yes, exactly. And one that I find especially fascinating is what we call anchoring. So this is how an initial number, like literally any number, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand, can sway our estimates. Our minds kind of get fixated on that very first piece of information, and then we struggle to adjust from there.
It's like that number becomes an anchor, and
And
our
never let
judgment is just pulled towards it, even if it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. There was this study done where they had people spin a wheel of fortune, but the wheel was actually rigged to land on either 10 or 65. And then they asked these people to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN.
Wait, but those two things have absolutely nothing to do with each
You
other.
go, right.
Darn.
But here's the thing. The people who spun a 10, they consistently guessed way, way lower than the people who spun a 65, even though the wheel was completely random. And it just shows how susceptible we are to this anchoring effect, even when the information we're given is, like, totally meaningless.
That is incredible. I mean, it makes you realize just how easily our judgment can be swayed, like by something we saw earlier, even if we think we're being totally objective in the moment.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah.
anchoring can affect everything from our
Mhm.
buying decisions to, like, salary negotiations and so much more. And this is just one of many, many thinking errors that Kahneman dives into. Another fascinating one is the availability heuristic.
Okay. Okay. Before we jump into that one, can we just like rewind for a sec? You mentioned salary negotiations, and I'm like always so nervous about those. So how does this anchoring thing play out in that situation?
Oh, great question. Let's say you're negotiating a starting salary for a new job, right? So if the employer is the one who throws out a number first, even if that number is like totally low ball, just not justified at all, it can still anchor your expectations.
Yeah.
And you might actually end up accepting a lower offer than you would have if you had proposed number first.
Oh, so it's almost like whoever throws out the first number like sets the stage for the whole negotiation, even if it's totally arbitrary.
Exactly, exactly. It's all about being aware of these like subtle influences so that you can kind of navigate these situations more strategically.
That is good to keep in mind. I'm definitely going to have to practice like throwing out the first number next time I negotiate.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now we can talk about the availability heuristic. So this is the one where we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy for us to recall, right? Like if it was something really vivid or it just happened recently.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Our brains, they really prioritize information that's easy to access. So if something comes to mind easily, we just kind of automatically assume it must be like more common, more frequent,
Yeah.
more likely to happen. But that's not always the case.
It's like how, when we see all those news stories about crime or plane crashes, it can make us feel like we're much more vulnerable than we actually are, even though statistically those events are incredibly rare. It's just that we see those stories and they're so dramatic that it makes us think they happen all the time.
Exactly, exactly. And the media really capitalizes on that, right? They focus on those dramatic events because that's what's going to get our attention. So it makes them more memorable and therefore more available in our minds.
It's almost like our brains are like playing tricks on us, making us see these patterns and probabilities where they don't actually exist. So, okay, Kahneman also talks about another thinking error called the illusion of understanding. So what's that one all about?
Right. So the illusion of understanding, it's our very strong tendency to create these narratives that make sense of the past, even if those narratives are like way oversimplified or maybe just totally wrong. You know,
Yeah.
it's so tempting to look back on things and be like, oh yeah, that was inevitable, or it was always destined to happen that way.
Totally. It's like that saying, hindsight is 20/20. But that clarity we get in hindsight, it can be really deceiving.
Absolutely, yeah. It leads us to like really overestimate our ability to have predicted those events, beforehand.
Hmm.
And Kahneman actually uses the example of Google's success. So it's easy for us to look back and think, oh, well, of course they were successful. The founders were brilliant. It was
Right.
obvious.
It was a foregone conclusion.
Right. But actually, there were countless other factors that played a role, right? Like luck, timing, the decisions of countless other people. And, as humans, we crave those simple, clean narratives, right? We want a nice, neat story. But unfortunately, that often comes at the expense of accuracy.
Yeah. It's like all those rags to riches stories we hear, right? Like, sure, hard work is important, but those stories often, they gloss over all those other factors like privilege, luck, timing, all that stuff that contributes to success.
Exactly. And this bias can really affect our future decisions too, because if we think we like perfectly understand the past, we're much less likely to question our own assumptions and we're more likely to repeat the same mistakes.
So it's about like being a little more critical of those easy narratives, right? Like recognizing that things are often more complex than they appear on the surface.
Absolutely. So embracing uncertainty and actively seeking out alternative explanations, that can help us counter this illusion of understanding.
Okay, I like that. So now let's talk about something I think everyone can relate to, at least on a gut level, loss aversion.
Ah, yes. Loss aversion. This is a big one, right? So it's the principle that the pain of losing something, it actually outweighs the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. It's a really powerful force in our decision-making, and it often makes us, overly cautious and risk-averse.
It's like, losing a $10 bill feels way, way worse than finding a $10 bill feels good, even though objectively it's the same amount of money.
Exactly. And this plays out in so many ways in our lives. So one example is what we call the endowment effect. This is basically the idea that we tend to value things we own more highly simply because we own them.
Like that experiment with the coffee mugs, where they like randomly gave some people mugs and then those people wouldn't sell them for a price that other people were willing to pay. Just owning the mug made them think it was way more valuable.
Precisely. Once we possess something, we become, very reluctant to part with it,
Yeah.
even if we got it completely by chance. And this fear of loss, it can lead to some irrational behavior, especially when it comes to finances.
You're talking about the disposition effect, right? Where we like hold on to losing investments way too long and then we sell our winning investments too soon, all because of our emotions.
Exactly. Our feelings can really hijack our rational decision-making and lead to some not so great choices. But, knowing about this bias can actually help us make those more, rational financial decisions, even when it feels emotionally tough.
So it's about learning to like separate our emotions from the facts and step back and really see the situation clearly.
Precisely. And make choices based on those long-term goals, right? Not just short-term feelings. Now prepare yourself for this one. Kahneman introduces the concept of two selves. We have the experiencing self and the remembering self. And get this, they don't always agree.
Two selves. Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more.
So the experiencing self, that's the one that's living in the moment, right?
Yeah.
Feeling every sensation, every emotion as it happens. Then we have the remembering self, and that's the one that retains and shapes our memories of those experiences.
So it's like two different perspectives on the same event, like one from the inside and then one looking back afterward.
Exactly. And those two different perspectives can actually lead to very, very different judgments about like the overall value of an experience.
Yeah.
So let's imagine a painful medical procedure, right? Objectively speaking, a longer procedure is going to be worse because it means more total pain.
Right, that makes sense. More time equals more pain.
But here's the thing. The remembering self might actually prefer the longer procedure if the ending of it is less painful. It's
Yeah.
almost like the memory of that final moment overrides the memory of the whole experience.
Wow, that's so interesting. So even though the experiencing self, endured more pain overall, the remembering self focuses on the quality of the ending. That's kind of mind-blowing. It makes me rethink certain experiences I've had.
Exactly. And it actually affects how we evaluate things like vacations, too, right?
Mhm.
We tend to remember them based on the most memorable moments and then how they ended, not necessarily like the entire duration.
Well, that's so true. I've definitely had vacations where there were like a few not so great moments, but then I had one amazing day where the last day was really positive, and that just totally colors my whole memory of the trip.
Exactly. And it highlights how our memories aren't always like perfectly accurate representations of our actual experiences,
Yeah.
right? The remembering self is selective. It focuses on certain aspects and kind of downplays others. And this has a big influence on our future choices as well.
Okay, so we've got these two systems battling it out in our heads, all these thinking errors and biases pulling us in different directions. That's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But don't worry, we're going to delve even deeper into specific biases, how they show up in our everyday lives, and some strategies to help you navigate them.
Okay, good. Because I'm already starting to question everything I thought I knew about, like how I think. This is definitely a deep dive.
It is, but trust me, it's worth the journey. Understanding how our minds work is one of the most, empowering things we can do. It helps us make better decisions. It helps us understand ourselves and other people more deeply, and ultimately, I think, live more fulfilling lives.
Well, I'm definitely on board for that. So are you ready to keep going?
Absolutely. Let's dive deeper.
Okay, so we've kind of established that our minds are like full of these fascinating little quirks and biases.
Mm.
But how do those quirks actually play out like in the real world? Like let's talk about how our minds construct narratives, even when those stories, those narratives might not be entirely accurate.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we're remarkably good at finding patterns, right? Creating stories,
Hmm.
even when those patterns are really just illusions. Our minds are constantly trying to make sense of, well, everything, really, even random events.
It's like our brains are these incredible storytellers, always looking for a plot, even when there really isn't one.
Right. Kahneman actually talks about how system one, that quick, intuitive part of our mind, is like a master storyteller. It effortlessly weaves together information from our senses, our memories, and our beliefs, and it just creates this seamless narrative.
But that desire for a neat story, that can sometimes lead to biases, right? Like seeing connections where none exist.
Absolutely. Our tendency to seek coherence, it can
Yeah.
lead us to really oversimplify complex situations. And we tend to ignore information that doesn't fit our preconceived notions.
So even when we think we're being totally objective, our brains might be filling in the gaps with our own assumptions and biases. We're not as impartial as we think we are.
Exactly. And one example Kahneman uses is how we perceive causality. We're kind of wired as humans to see these cause and effect relationships, even when events are just random coincidence. He describes this study where they had people watch an animated film with these geometric shapes moving around.
To just shapes, like bouncing around, nothing too exciting.
Right. Just shapes.
Yeah.
But consistently, people would attribute intentions and emotions to these shapes, even though they were just moving randomly.
So we're just so eager to find meaning that we'll project it onto anything, even triangles and circles. But this tendency to see patterns, it can lead to some pretty funny misunderstandings too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember Kahneman's anecdote about the bond prices reacting to Saddam Hussein's capture in Iraq?
Oh yeah, that's a classic example. So first, the bond prices went up, and Bloomberg News, always looking for that cause and effect story, flashed the headline: U.S. Treasuries rise. Hussein Abshur may not curb terrorism.
Right. But then bond prices fell back down.
Mhm.
And super quickly, the headline changed to U.S. Treasuries fall, Hussein capture boosts allure of risky assets. Same event. Two totally opposite explanations.
It's hilarious, but also a little concerning, right? Because it just shows how easily we can be misled by these seemingly rational explanations. We think we're getting the full story, but maybe we're not.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to be a little bit skeptical.
Mhm.
Be skeptical of those easy answers, those simple narratives, and always consider alternative explanations. Sometimes things just happen for no particular reason.
Okay, so we've got these storytelling brains, always looking for patterns, explanations. But how can we make better decisions knowing that our minds are so prone to these biases? How do we work around them?
So Kahneman introduces this concept of substituting questions. And basically what it describes is how system one, that intuitive part of our mind, just takes over when we're faced with a really tough question. So instead of actually tackling that complex issue head on, we unconsciously replace it with a simpler, more readily available question.
So we avoid the hard work of actually thinking through the complex issue. Huh, that sounds like me.
Oh, it's something we all do. It's a very human thing to do.
Yeah.
And this substitution, it just happens automatically. We don't even realize we're doing it.
Yeah.
It's our brain's way of saving energy, avoiding mental strain.
Can you give an example of that? Like how does that play out in real life?
Sure, yeah. Imagine you're asked to evaluate
Yeah.
the investment potential of a new startup.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a super complex question, right?
Yeah.
Requires lots of research analysis. But instead of doing all that, your system one might just substitute a much simpler question like, do I like the company's product?
Hmm.
Or do I find the CEO charismatic?
So we end up basing our decisions on these superficial factors that are easy to evaluate, right? Rather than the underlying substance, we're judging the book by its cover, so to speak.
Exactly. And this can lead to some really, really bad decisions, especially in areas like, investing or hiring. We might choose that flashy product over a more reliable one, or we might hire that super charming candidate who actually lacks the necessary skills.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap of substituting questions? Like how do we catch ourselves doing it?
The key is awareness, right?
Okay.
Recognize when you're actually answering a different question than the one you were asked. So slow down your decision-making process. Engage system two, that slower system,
Mhm.
and really deliberately analyze the relevant information.
So it's about being more mindful, less impulsive, taking the time to really think things through, even when it's super tempting to just go with our gut.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about a bias that can have a huge impact on our judgments. The halo effect. So this is our tendency to generalize from one positive trait to a person's overall character. So if someone is, attractive or intelligent, we might automatically assume that they're also kind, honest, trustworthy, all these other positive qualities.
It's like we put a halo on them, right? Based on that one initial positive impression. But that can be so misleading.
Oh, absolutely. And this halo, it can really significantly influence our judgments, even in areas where that initial trait is totally irrelevant. Kahneman uses the example of evaluating political candidates, right?
Yeah.
We're often swayed by their appearance or maybe their speaking style more than their actual policies or qualifications.
Ah, that is so true. I've definitely been guilty of that one. Like, a candidate can seem so charismatic and charming, but then when you actually look at their policies, they might not align with your values at all.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how the halo effect can lead to, like, poor decision making. We end up voting for candidates who, look and sound good
Right.
rather than those who might actually be the best suited for the job.
So how do we guard against the halo effect? Like, how do we avoid being blinded by the halo?
Well, I think the key is to be aware of it, right? And try to judge people based on their individual merits, not just based on one single positive trait. So be more critical, more discerning. Take the time to really gather information before you form an opinion. Don't just go by first impressions.
Okay, so we need to be like more critical thinkers, more discerning in our judgments. But can psychology actually be taught? Like, can we really teach people to overcome these biases? Kahneman seems a bit skeptical about that.
He is. He describes this classic experiment where they gave people statistics about different groups, and then they asked them to make predictions about individuals within those groups.
So, for example, telling them that like a certain percentage of cab drivers in a city are reckless, and then asking them to judge the likelihood of a specific cab driver being reckless.
Right? And what they found was that people often completely ignored the statistical information, and instead they relied on stereotypes or maybe personal anecdotes.
So even when we're presented with clear evidence, our biases can still like override our rational judgment. That's a little disheartening.
It is. It's not just about giving people the right information. It's about actually changing how they think,
Hmm.
making them more aware of their biases, and making them more willing to question their own intuitions.
So it's more about cultivating like a mindset of critical thinking rather than just memorizing facts and figures.
Exactly. Kahneman suggests that teaching psychology might be more effective if it focuses on like specific biases and gives people very concrete examples of how those biases can lead to bad decisions. But even then, there's no guarantee that people will be able to overcome those deeply ingrained biases.
So it's an ongoing challenge, right? Both for educators and for individuals to learn to think more rationally. Speaking of challenges, let's talk about the illusion of skill. This is the idea that we tend to like overestimate our abilities, especially in areas where chance plays a big role.
Yeah, this is a very pervasive illusion. It affects people in all sorts of professions. We see patterns in random data, we mistake luck for skill, and we become, overly confident in our ability to predict the future.
Like those financial gurus who claim they can like beat the market.
Exactly. Study after study has shown that mutual fund managers, they consistently fail to outperform the market over the long term. And yet, investors keep pouring money into actively managed funds because they believe that those managers have some like special insight, some special ability.
It's like we want to believe in expertise, even when the evidence says it doesn't really exist. We want to believe someone has the magic formula.
Right. And this illusion, it's especially strong in fields where the feedback is like ambiguous or delayed. So if we don't get clear, immediate feedback on our decisions, it's easier to just believe that we're skilled, even if we're not.
So it's easier to maintain that illusion of control, right? When we can't clearly see the results of our actions. But
Yeah.
how do we guard against this illusion of skill?
Well, I think humility is key, right? Acknowledge the limits of your knowledge, acknowledge the role of chance in success and failure, seek out objective feedback, measure your performance against like a reliable benchmark, and be willing to, adjust your strategies based on the results.
So be less reliant on gut feelings and more data-driven, and be willing to admit when we're wrong.
Exactly. True expertise isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing what you don't know and being open to new information. Now, let's dive into one of Kahneman's most influential ideas, prospect theory. This is his groundbreaking work on how people actually make decisions when they're facing risk and uncertainty.
Prospect theory. Okay, this sounds intense.
It is. It really challenges traditional economic models that assume that people are always rational and that they always choose the option with the highest expected value.
So not how humans actually behave in the real world.
All right. Kahneman argues that our decisions are heavily influenced by our emotional responses to gains and losses. So basically, we're much more sensitive to losses than we are to gains.
Like how losing, say, $100 feels way worse than gaining $100 feels good, even though it's the same amount.
Exactly. And this difference between how we feel about gains and losses, it has a huge impact on our decisions. It makes us risk averse when it comes to potential gains, and then risk seeking when we're facing potential losses.
So we're more likely to like gamble to avoid a loss than we are to secure a win of the same amount. We really hate losing.
That's the power of loss aversion. Kahneman and Tversky, they did all these experiments showing that like people are more likely to choose a sure gain of say $3,000 over an 80% chance to win $4,000.
So they'd rather take the guaranteed smaller amount than risk getting nothing at all.
Right. But they're also more likely to choose an 80% chance to lose $4,000 over a sure loss of $3,000.
So they'd rather risk losing even more just to avoid that guaranteed loss. That seems kind of backwards.
It is, but that's how powerful loss aversion is. It can make us act irrationally,
Yeah.
even if it means potentially losing even more money.
So what does prospect theory mean for our like everyday decisions? How do we use this information?
Well, it tells us to be aware of our emotional biases
Yeah.
and to try to make decisions based on like a more objective view of the risks and rewards.
Mm.
It also highlights the importance of framing. So how a choice is presented, that can actually significantly influence our decisions.
Yeah, Kahneman talks about how doctors present like treatment options. If they frame a surgery as having, say, a 90% survival rate, patients are much more likely to choose it. But if they frame it as having a 10% mortality rate,
Yeah.
people are much less likely to choose it.
Even though it's the exact same information, right? It's just the framing triggers different emotional responses and therefore different choices. So it's not just about the facts, it's about how those facts are presented to us.
So the way information is presented can completely change our perspective, even if the underlying facts are the same. It's almost like marketing in a way.
Exactly. Prospect theory just reminds us to be aware of those framing effects and to try to make decisions based on like the underlying information, not just how it's presented.
Okay, so we need to be wary of how choices are framed. But what about the certainty effect? What's that all about?
So the certainty effect is basically our tendency to overvalue outcomes that are certain, even if they're, less favorable than uncertain outcomes that have like higher expected values. It's a bit counterintuitive, but it reflects our very strong preference for certainty. We like to know what's going to happen. We don't like uncertainty.
So we're drawn to that sure thing, right? Even if it might not be the best option in the long run.
Right. Think about this. Would you rather have a sure gain of $30 or an 80% chance to win $40?
That's tough.
Most people, they go for that guaranteed $30, right? Even though the gamble, it could potentially get them more.
I can see myself doing that. It's like the sure thing just feels safer, even if the gamble might have a better payoff. But this certainty effect, it works in reverse too, right?
Yes. We're also willing to pay a premium to avoid uncertainty, even if it means accepting a less favorable outcome. So would you rather have a sure loss of $30 or an 80% chance to lose $40?
Losses are always tough. But I think I'd choose the gamble, even though I know I could end up losing more.
Most people do. It's like we're willing to pay what we might call a certainty tax to avoid the possibility of a larger loss. So the certainty effect, it just shows how powerful those emotions are towards gains and losses. It can really lead us to make choices that don't necessarily make sense from a purely rational perspective.
So we're not always these like cold, calculating decision makers. Our emotions play a much bigger role than we probably realize.
Absolutely. Understanding these tendencies can help us make, more informed decisions, even in situations where there's risk and uncertainty involved.
Okay, now let's talk about the possibility effect. This one sounds a bit like wishful thinking.
It is. The possibility effect is basically our tendency to overvalue very small probabilities. So we give them way more weight in our decisions than they objectively deserve. And it's what fuels our fascination with, like lotteries and gambling. We're drawn to that potential for a huge payoff, even if the odds of winning are incredibly slim.
So we focus on that dream even if the reality is much less glamorous.
Exactly. We're more focused on the potential upside than the much, much higher probability of losing. And this can lead us to make some not so great decisions, like buying lottery tickets or investing in risky ventures with low chances of success.
So it's important to be like realistic about the probabilities involved. Don't let those dazzling what ifs cloud your judgment. Now, what about mental accounting? How does that fit into all of this?
So mental accounting is basically how we mentally categorize and track our money. It's kind of a way to simplify our financial decision making, but it can also lead to some some irrational behavior.
So it's like we create these different buckets in our minds for different types of money.
Exactly. And one example of this is the sunk cost fallacy. This is our tendency to keep investing in something even when it's clearly not working out,
Yeah.
simply because we've already put time, money, or effort into it.
Oh, I do this all the time. Like staying in a movie, even though I hate it, just because I paid for the ticket.
That's a perfect example. We're trying to justify our past decisions, even when they're no longer serving us. We're so focused on avoiding that perceived loss that we ignore the opportunity cost of our time and energy.
So how do we overcome that sunk cost fallacy? It seems like a hard one to break.
Well, the key is to really focus on the future, right? Focus on the potential benefits and the potential costs of continuing versus stopping. Those past investments, they're irrelevant to the current decision. It's okay to cut your losses and move on.
So it's about being more like adaptable, recognizing when it's time to change course. Don't get stuck in the past. Now, what about the framing effect? We touched on that briefly with prospect theory, but how else does framing influence our decisions?
Yeah, so the framing effect, it just shows how dramatically the way a choice is presented can influence our decisions.
Mhm.
Even if, objectively, the underlying options are exactly the same. Remember that example with a sure gain of $20 or a 50% chance to win $40?
Yeah, most people choose the sure gain, even though the gamble has the same expected value.
Right. But if you frame it as a sure loss of $20 or a 50% chance to lose $40, most people choose the gamble, even though objectively the options are equivalent, right? It's just that the framing, it triggers different emotions and therefore different choices.
So again, it's all about presentation, right? The same information can be spun in these different ways to appeal to our emotions and our biases.
Exactly. And it just shows how susceptible we are to those subtle cues and how our choices aren't always based on this rational assessment of the facts.
Okay, so we're not as rational as we think we are. Our emotions, these biases, the way choices are presented, it's all swirling around in our heads, influencing our decisions. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But understanding these influences, it actually gives us more control. We can start making more conscious, more deliberate choices.
All right, you've convinced me. I'm ready to keep exploring these mental mysteries. So what's next on our deep dive agenda?
Let's tackle preference reversals. This is a fascinating phenomenon that really challenges the whole idea of stable and consistent preferences.
Sounds intriguing. Let's do it. Okay, preference reversals. This sounds like one of those mind-bending concepts that makes you question everything you thought you knew about making decisions.
It definitely is. Preference reversals, they happen when our choices basically flip-flop depending on how the options are presented to us, or, the method that's used to elicit our preferences. It really challenges that classic economic idea that our preferences are stable and consistent.
So our choices aren't always as straightforward as we think they are.
Right. Kahneman describes this experiment where they had people choose between two different bets. So one bet had a high chance of winning a small amount of money, while the other bet had a low chance of winning a large amount of money.
So it's like playing it safe versus going for the big win. I can see how that would be a tough choice.
Exactly. And when they asked people which bet they preferred, most people chose the safer bet, the one with a higher chance of winning a small amount. But when they asked people to put a dollar value on each bet, they actually gave a higher value to the riskier bet, the one with the low chance of a big win.
So their preferences literally reverse depending on how the question was asked. That's wild.
It is, and it really suggests that our preferences aren't always so clear-cut. And they can be influenced by, how choices are presented or how we're asked to think about them.
It makes you realize how much is going on beneath the surface when we're making these decisions. We think we know what we want, but maybe we don't.
Absolutely. It challenges that whole idea that we're, always these rational actors making decisions in our own best interest. Our choices are influenced by all sorts of factors, many of which we're not even consciously aware of.
Okay, so our preferences can be a bit slippery, I guess you could say, depending on the context. What about this negativity bias you mentioned earlier? I feel like that's something we see a lot in the world today.
Oh, it is. The negativity bias, it's our tendency to pay way more attention to negative information than positive information. And it's a very powerful bias. It has deep evolutionary roots.
So back in the day, it was more important to focus on the saber-toothed tiger lurking in the bushes than on, the pretty flowers.
Exactly. Our ancestors who were more attuned to threats and dangers, they were the ones who were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. But in today's world where we have this constant barrage of negative news coming at us from all directions, this bias can lead to a very, very skewed view of reality.
It's like we're wired to see the worst case scenario, even when things are generally going okay. We're always bracing for the bad news.
Right. We might overestimate the chances of bad things happening and underestimate the good things. And it can affect our relationships, too.
Yeah, how so?
Well, we might focus on our partner's flaws, for example, instead of their good qualities.
Yeah.
Or we might dwell on our failures instead of celebrating our successes.
So how do we combat this negativity bias? It seems like it's baked into our DNA.
Well, awareness is always the first step. Recognize that your brain is naturally drawn to negative information. And then make a conscious effort to seek out positive news. Focus on the good things in your life. Practice gratitude.
So make a conscious effort to look for the good, celebrate the positive, don't let the negative stuff dominate our thinking.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about happiness. Kahneman distinguishes between two different types of happiness. He calls them experienced well-being and life satisfaction.
Two types of happiness. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
So experienced well-being, that's basically our moment-to-moment feeling of happiness. It's about how we feel right now in this moment. Life satisfaction is a broader evaluation of our lives as a whole.
So you could be having a great day, but still feel unsatisfied with your life overall.
Exactly. And our memories, they actually play a really big role in our life satisfaction. We tend to remember and evaluate our lives based on the most memorable moments and how they ended, not necessarily the sum of all our experiences.
So one amazing vacation can outweigh months of routine work, at least in our memories.
Right. Kahneman calls this the peak end rule. And he says we can actually boost our overall life satisfaction by creating more of those positive peak experiences and by ensuring that our lives end on a good note.
So it's not just about maximizing happiness in each and every moment. It's also about creating those lasting positive memories. That's a really great way to think about it.
Yeah, it reminds us that we actually have some control over how we remember our lives. We can actively shape our memories by, focusing on the good and creating those peak experiences.
Okay, I want to hear more about this focusing illusion you mentioned earlier. It sounds like something I'm definitely prone to.
The focusing illusion. It's basically our tendency to overestimate the importance of things that are currently grabbing our attention. So when we're focused on something, it feels huge.
Yeah.
And we think it's going to have a major impact on our happiness.
Right.
But often that's not actually the case.
Oh, I do this all the time. I get fixated on some problem, and it feels like it's the biggest thing in the world. But then a week later, it turns out to be not that big of a deal.
Exactly. Kahneman gives this example where they ask people about their happiness, and then they ask them how many dates they'd had recently. And it turned out that the number of dates had a much stronger influence on their reported happiness than anything else, simply because it was, top of mind at that moment.
It's like we shine a spotlight on that one specific thing, and we just ignore everything else that's going on.
Right. And it can lead us to make some bad decisions because we overinvest in things that we think will make us happy, like a new car or a bigger house. And then, we find out that they actually have a much smaller impact on our well-being than we expected.
So how do we avoid falling for this focusing illusion? How do we get out of that spotlight?
Well, be aware of it. Recognize that your attention is naturally drawn to things that are, new or salient. But those things might not actually be truly important. So force yourself to consider a wider range of factors when you're making decisions. Don't get too narrowly fixated on any one thing.
So step back, look at the bigger picture. Don't let that one thing dominate your thinking.
Now let's talk about libertarian paternalism. I know it's a mouthful, but it's a really fascinating concept.
Libertarian paternalism, those two words seem to contradict each other.
They do. But it's basically the idea that you can influence people's choices in a way that benefits them without actually taking away their freedom of choice.
So it's like nudging people in the right direction, but not forcing them.
Exactly. It's based on the idea that our choices are often influenced by, subtle cues and framing effects. And Kahneman and his colleague Richard Thaler, they argue that we can use these nudges, they call them, to promote behaviors that are in people's best interest, like saving for retirement or eating healthy foods.
Like making enrollment in a retirement savings plan the default option, right? People are much more likely to save if they have to, opt out rather than opt in.
Exactly. It's a really simple change, but it can have a huge impact. Libertarian paternalism, it's a little bit controversial, but it is gaining traction as a way to like address societal problems without resorting to, force or regulation.
It's about recognizing that people aren't always rational and using our understanding of, human behavior to design environments that encourage better choices.
Now, let's touch on priming. This is a concept that's used a lot in psychology. Priming is the idea that exposure to a stimulus, like a word or an image, can actually influence our later thoughts and behavior, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
So something we see or hear can unconsciously affect how we act later on. That's a little freaky.
It is a little bit. Kahneman describes this experiment where they exposed people to words that were related to old age, like words like Florida and wrinkle.
Okay, I'm picturing a bunch of words about retirement and rocking chairs.
Right, and get this, the people who were exposed to these words, they actually walked slower down the hallway afterwards than the people who weren't exposed to those words.
Just from seeing words about old age, that's wild.
It really is. And it just shows how powerful our unconscious mind can be. Priming has been used to explain all sorts of things, from consumer choices to political attitudes.
So if I see a commercial for a really delicious burger right before I go grocery shopping, I'm more likely to buy ground beef.
Exactly. Or studies have shown that people are more likely to buy French wine if they hear French music playing in the store.
It makes you realize how much our environment is constantly influencing us, below our level of awareness. We think we're making these independent choices, but
Right. Priming is a little bit of a controversial topic, but
yeah.
it really highlights the importance of considering those subtle ways that our environment can shape our thoughts and our behaviors.
Okay, now for a bias that can lead to maybe some embarrassing moments, the illusion of familiarity.
So this is our tendency to mistake familiarity for knowledge or understanding. We assume we know more about something than we actually do simply because it feels familiar to us.
Like reading a word in a clear font. We feel like we understand it, even if we've never seen that word before.
Right. But if it's in a blurry font, we're more likely to realize that we don't actually know it. So that ease of processing information, it can make us really overestimate our understanding.
So just because something feels easy or familiar doesn't mean we actually know it that well. That's a good reality check.
It is. And this illusion can have real-world consequences because we might make decisions based on that, shaky understanding. Or we might be overconfident in our abilities.
It's important to question our assumptions, even when things feel easy or intuitive. Don't let familiarity fool you. Speaking of feeling easy, what about this idea of cognitive ease?
So cognitive ease, it's that feeling of fluency and effortlessness that we get when we're processing information. And basically when things are easy for us to think about, we're much more likely to believe them.
So it's not just about the message itself, but how it's presented.
Exactly. Kahneman says that this cognitive ease, it can be manipulated, both intentionally and unintentionally, to sway our beliefs. So, for example, statements that are repeated often or that are printed very clearly, they're more likely to be seen as true, simply because they're easier to process.
So it's like those marketing slogans that get stuck in your head. The more you hear them, the more you start to believe them, even if you don't have any real reason to.
Precisely. Cognitive ease can be a very powerful persuasion tool, but it can also really mislead us. So we need to be critical of information that's presented in a way that makes it seem effortless or familiar. And we need to challenge our own beliefs, even when they feel very comfortable to us.
So don't just go with what feels easy. Think critically and question those assumptions. Now, this might sound kind of counterintuitive, but Kahneman also talks about how effort can actually improve our performance. How does that work?
So he argues that when we're mentally strained, our system two, that slower, more deliberate part of our mind, it kind of kicks in and overrides our intuitive system one. And he actually did this study where they had people solve math problems, and they asked some of the people to hold a 7-digit number in their minds while they were doing it.
So they were deliberately put under pressure.
Right. And those people, the ones who were under pressure, they actually solved the problems more accurately than the people who weren't under strain.
So a little mental workout can actually sharpen our thinking.
Exactly. When we're mentally taxed, we slow down, we think carefully, and we're less likely to make those careless mistakes. It's a reminder that a little bit of effort can go a long way.
Okay, I like that.
Huh?
Challenge yourself. Engage that system too. Now, what about ego depletion?
So ego depletion is the idea that our mental resources, they're limited. and they can actually be depleted by effortful tasks.
Ah.
So after we've exerted a lot of mental energy, we're more likely to make impulsive decisions, we're more likely to give in to temptation, and we're more likely to just perform poorly overall.
It's like our willpower runs out.
Exactly,
Yep.
like a muscle getting tired after a workout. And there are tons and tons of studies that show this effect. For example, they did a study where they had people suppress their emotional reactions to a very disturbing film. And then later on, those people did worse on the tasks that required self-control.
So if you're already mentally drained, you're more likely to cave to that, like, extra slice of cake or that tempting purchase.
Exactly.
So how do we combat this ego depletion?
Well, again, awareness is key. Recognize that your mental energy is limited. Avoid overloading yourself. Take breaks, get enough sleep, eat healthy foods, and practice mindfulness so you can make more conscious choices about how you spend your mental energy.
So treat your willpower like a muscle, right? Train it, but don't overwork it. And give it the fuel it needs.
Now, for a final thought from Kahneman, he really emphasizes the importance of awareness.
He does. He says that we're all susceptible to these thinking errors, all these biases, but by understanding them, we can start to recognize them in ourselves and make more, rational choices.
It's not about eliminating these biases entirely, because, it's probably impossible, but it's about recognizing their influence and developing strategies to mitigate their impact.
It's about being more mindful of our thinking, questioning our assumptions, actively seeking out different perspectives.
And remembering that even the most brilliant minds aren't immune to these biases. We all make mistakes.
Well, this deep dive has been an incredible journey into, like, how our minds work. I feel like I have a whole new toolbox for understanding and navigating my own decision making.
Okay.
Thinking Fast and Slow, it's definitely a must read for anyone who wants to, like, sharpen their thinking skills.
Absolutely. It challenges our assumptions, it helps us understand human behavior more deeply, and ultimately it empowers us to make better decisions in all areas of our lives.
So as you go about your day to day, pay attention to your thoughts. Notice when your intuition might be leading you down the wrong path, or when those mental shortcuts are, taking over.
Remember, awareness is the first step.
Hmm.
By recognizing those biases, you can start to overcome their influence and make choices that truly align with your goals and values.
And that's a wrap for our deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow. Keep those minds sharp, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.